The sun hung heavy over Fort Henderson like it wanted to melt the world. The desert heat shimmered across the asphalt until the air itself seemed to waver. The guard booth at the main gate sat crooked in the light. Its paint cracked, its shadow short and sharp. Private Ryan Miller leaned against the window ledge. His sleeves rolled high, sunglasses slipping down his nose as he wiped a line of sweat from his neck. Beside him, Sergeant Daniel Cole chewed on a toothpick, his cap tilted back, his rifle slung over one shoulder. Their posture said everything about the base that day. It was too hot to care, too quiet to matter. They traded half-hearted jokes about visitors who never came, their laughter flat in the dry air. The road stretched empty in both directions, disappearing into the glare. Then a hum rose from far away, low and steady, the kind of sound that didn't belong in the silence. A black Chevrolet Suburban rolled into view, its tires throwing up a trail of dust that caught the light like smoke. The vehicle slowed as it neared the gate, engine idling in a low growl. Miller straightened, but only slightly, tugging at his vest more out of habit than respect. Cole glanced over, squinting through the heat haze. The SUV stopped, the passenger door opened, and a woman stepped out. She moved like someone used to carrying weight without showing it. Early 40s. Hair tied back. Posture sharp, even without a uniform. She wore simple civilian clothes, desert boots, and carried a small leather folder in her left hand. The air around her seemed to still for a moment. Miller tilted his head, his tone casual, almost lazy, asking if he could help her. Her answer was calm, her voice steady, saying she was here to report for duty. The words didn't fit the picture, and for a second, he blinked. Then he laughed, shaking his head, telling her that civilians don't just walk into restricted areas. The woman didn't move, didn't argue. Her gaze stayed fixed, unreadable behind the sunlight. Cole shifted uncomfortably, sensing something different about her but saying nothing. The SUV's engine hummed quietly, heat rising in waves around them. The smell of oil and dust mixed in the air, somewhere far off. A flag flapped weakly against its pole. Miller smirked again, not realizing that the ground beneath his boots had already started to shift. The base, the gate, even the air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. The folder was worn but neat, edges smooth as if handled often. The woman held it out without hesitation, her voice level as she said her name and purpose. Colonel Evelyn Reed, reporting to assume command of Fort Henderson. The words landed softly, but something in their precision made them impossible to ignore. Miller blinked once, then let a crooked grin slip across his face. He said anyone could print out transfer orders these days, that high school kids could fake a military seal. Cole stepped forward, taking the folder from her hand with more care than Miller expected. He flipped through the pages. The documents were crisp, marked with the Department of Defense seal, the signature of a brigadier general at regional command, and stamped approval codes that looked official. Still, no one had told them about a new commanding officer. Cole looked up, his jaw tight, and decided to check it out. He turned toward the booth, lifting the radio mic. Post 1 to TOC. Over. The radio crackled. TOC copies. Go ahead. Over. Civilian female at the gate claims to be Colonel Evelyn Reed, incoming CO for Fort Henderson. Request verification. Over. TOC copies. Stand by. The channel went dead again, leaving only the sound of static. The air felt thicker now, as if the heat had weight. Reed didn't move. She stood near the hood of the Suburban, her folder clasped behind her back, her eyes scanning everything around her. The crooked flagpole, the peeling paint on the security sign, the empty can of soda by the door. She noticed everything, but said nothing. Cole shifted his stance. Miller tried to joke about reporters sneaking onto bases, but his words came out too loud. too nervous. The radio hissed once, then went silent again. Minutes stretched. The SUV's engine kept running. A low hum that filled the space where conversation should have been. Cole adjusted his cap, his throat dry. He wasn't sure why. But the longer the woman stood there, the more he felt like they were the ones being inspected. Reed didn't speak, didn't even glance at the clock. Yet the silence seemed to obey her. The sunlight glared off the booth window, catching the sweat on Miller's neck. The radio stayed quiet, and both men began to wonder if they'd just made a very big mistake. The radio came alive with a sudden crackle that cut through the thick silence. The static popped once, then steadied into a clear, clipped voice from base command. Post 1. This is TOC. Confirm Colonel Evelyn Reed. Incoming commanding officer. Fort Henderson. Clear her immediately. The words hit like a hammer. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The desert air pressed down, heavy and unmoving, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. Miller stared at the radio in disbelief. His mouth open but no sound coming out. Cole's hand trembled slightly around the mic. Reed didn't move. Her eyes stayed on them. Calm, steady, almost passion. The same composure that had felt strange before now filled the air with authority. Cole swallowed, his throat dry. He managed to stammer a response back to command. Acknowledging the order, the silence that followed was louder than any shout. Miller tried to find words, mumbling that they didn't know, that no one told them. Reed turned her gaze toward him, her voice even and quiet. I know, that's the problem. Nothing more, nothing less. The sound of engines rose in the distance, low and controlled. A convoy appeared along the road, 3 black sedans rolling through the shimmer of heat, dust trailing behind them. When they stopped at the checkpoint, doors opened in unison. Boots hit the pavement with a sharp rhythm. At the front was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jackson, uniform pressed sharp, movements precise. He saluted the woman without hesitation and greeted her as Colonel Reed, commanding officer of Fort Henderson. The salute snapped like the crack of a flag in the wind. Miller and Cole stood frozen, then stumbled into a stiff attention, their faces pale under the sun. Sweat streaked down Miller's temple. His earlier arrogance burned away by shame. Cole's voice caught as he tried to apologize, but Reed raised a hand slightly. Save it, Sergeant. You were following what you thought were the standards. Her tone softened just enough to sound human, not forgiving, but understanding. She stepped past them toward the sedans. The sound of her boots on asphalt carried a rhythm that neither man would ever forget. She paused once more before leaving, looking back at the gate and the soldiers who had failed to guard it with respect. Tomorrow we start over? The words were soft but absolute, a command more powerful than any reprimand. The convoy doors closed. Engines rumbled. And as the vehicles rolled forward, Miller and Cole stood at full attention, their salutes trembling in the heat. The desert stayed silent, except for the echo of tires fading into distance. And for the first time, the base itself seemed to stand still in acknowledgement of its new commander. The next morning, Fort Henderson woke under a gray, heavy sky. Colonel Evelyn Reed arrived quietly at 700 hours. Her black SUV moving past the gate where Miller and Cole now stood straight as flagpoles. She said nothing as they saluted, only returned the gesture with a calm nod before driving deeper into the base. The roads were cracked and sun-bleached. The barracks that lined them looked tired, their paint flaking off in thin curls. Faded unit insignias peeled from the walls, and grass pushed through seams in the concrete like forgotten memories, reclaiming space. The sound of loose gravel under her boots filled the silence. She passed groups of soldiers walking without formation, their shoulders slouched, their uniforms untucked. A few nodded out of habit, but most looked past her, unaware of who she was. At the barracks, laundry hung from window frames, and gear lay scattered near the steps. The smell of dust and old sweat hung in the air. Reed paused, taking out a small notepad, jotting a few lines without expression. Her pen moved quietly, matching the rhythm of her slow, steady pace. When she reached the motor pool, she stopped for a long moment. Rows of Humvees and LMTVs sat still under a film of dirt, windshields streaked white with sand. A mechanic's coverall hung from an open door, empty. Swinging in the dry wind, a young captain hurried toward her. Name tape, reading Hayes. He straightened quickly, offering to gather the command staff for a formal briefing. Reed looked at him, his expression unreadable, and told him no, not yet. She wanted to see the truth before anyone had the chance to dress it up. Hayes hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. Reed walked on, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. She passed the PT field where trash lay scattered. Bleachers cracked, and no one called cadence anymore. Her thoughts drifted to dusty valleys in Afghanistan, where keeping a rifle clean could mean staying alive, and where discipline wasn't a slogan but a habit. Here, she saw no danger, yet the neglect felt just as deadly. She looked toward the flagpole at the center of the base. The flag barely stirred in the still air. Its colors faded under the sun. Fort Henderson wasn't broken because of what it lacked. It was broken because it had forgotten to care. Reed closed her notebook and stood still for a moment. The base around her was silent, waiting. She decided then that rebuilding wouldn't start with orders or punishment. It would start with standards. Real ones. The kind that teach people to take pride again, even when no one is watching. The first light of morning crept over the desert, soft but relentless. By 700 hours, the air already carried heat, dry and heavy enough to press against the skin. The black SUV rolled to a slow stop at Fort Henderson's main gate. Private Ryan Miller and Sergeant Daniel Cole stood at attention, uniforms crisp, boots shining dark in the pale sunlight. Their rifles were slung correctly this time. Safeties checked. Grips aligned. The same spot that once echoed with careless laughter now felt tense and still. Dust swirled around their feet. But neither man moved. Colonel Evelyn Reed stepped out of the vehicle, her cap tucked neatly under her arm. She took her time, eyes scanning every inch of the checkpoint. The flagpole still leaned slightly to the left. The paint along the guardrails was chipped, and a torn roster clung to the booth window, edges curling like old paper. She didn't speak right away. Her silence stretched, turning seconds into minutes. When she finally did, her voice was low and even, carrying more weight than any shout. She asked them if this, what stood before her, reflected the standard of the United States Army. Cole tried to answer, but the words stuck. Miller shifted his weight, wishing he could sink into the ground. Reed waited, expression unreadable. The only sound was the faint hum of the engine idling behind her. When neither man spoke, she nodded once and gave a simple order. Report to my office at 1600 hours. The time landed like a stamp on their memory. Both replied in unison. Voice tight. Yes. Mum. Reed gave a small nod. Her gaze steady. Then she turned and walked the perimeter, hands behind her back. Every movement controlled and deliberate. Later that afternoon, the air inside her office felt just as hot. Miller and Cole stood rigid across from her desk. Reed reviewed her notes without looking up. When she did, her tone was calm but final. You were the first to show me what's broken. You'll be the first to help fix it. She handed Cole a blank notepad, instructing them to list every deficiency at the gate before morning. Neither dared to protest. As they left, they felt something shift between them and the base itself. It wasn't fear, it was the return of standard, quiet and firm, like the first crack of light after a long night. By 700 hours, the sun was already climbing high, painting Fort Henderson in shades of glare and dust. Inside the guard booth, Private Ryan Miller and Sergeant Daniel Cole sat at a small metal desk, sleeves rolled, notebooks open, surrounded by old manuals and worn binders. The air smelled like paper, sweat, and determination. Their rifles rested neatly against the wall, bolts locked forward, dust covers closed. For once, the space felt more like a workspace than a break room. They spoke little, only trading short, focused words about checkpoints, inspections, and posture. Outside, the hum of traffic on the access road came and went, steady as a metronome. They started with the basics, rewriting the entry control point standard operating procedure from scratch. Step 1, greeting. Step 2, ID verification. Step 3, vehicle inspection. Miller read from an old Army manual, cross-referencing each instruction with Reed's notes. Unerhört Direktion. They detailed responses for every possible situation. Civilian visitors, contractors, reporters, and officers of higher rank. Their list grew precise, almost surgical. Post 1 to TOC. Vehicle inbound for clearance. TOC copies. Standby. Repeat until clear. Every phrase carried purpose. Each pause, a point of control. By 1300 hours, they'd finished their first draft. Reed arrived with her folder tucked under one arm, reading their notes in silence. Her pencil hovered over the paper as she underlined lines, crossed others out. Rewriting with tight precision, she said nothing for a long moment, then told them that good enough was not a standard. They would test the new protocol that night. She looked at both men, her expression unreadable, and ended with 5 quiet words that landed like an order and a challenge. You will own this gate. That evening, under the glare of the floodlights, the gate came alive again. Miller called out clear, crisp commands while Cole timed responses with a stopwatch. The team practiced until their words blended into rhythm. Salute. Verify. Inspect. Clear. They rehearsed traffic control, searched vehicles with care, and ran through drills until every move felt natural. Sweat darkened their collars, but no one complained. When the last car passed and the radios fell silent, the gate stood still in the heat and hum of night. For the first time in months, it looked like part of the United States Army again. By 7:15 a.m., the officers and NCOs of Fort Henderson filled the old conference room, the air thick with dust and faint traces of coffee. The blinds hung uneven, streaks of light cutting across the dull gray walls. Folders lay stacked on a long metal table, corners curled and labels faded. Colonel Evelyn Reed stood at the front. No podium, no slides, just her presence anchoring the space. She waited until the last bit of chatter died down. The quiet stretched long enough to make a few officers shift in their seats. Then she began to speak. Her voice was calm, each word deliberate, paced like footsteps across the floor. She said that leadership wasn't broken because people stopped caring, but because they stopped connecting. She called what came next the mentorship chain. Every lieutenant would mentor a sergeant, every sergeant a private. No one floats. The phrase carried through the room like a current. She explained that accountability would be shared. If one soldier failed to meet standard, the entire chain would answer for it. If a uniform was wrinkled or a formation late, it wasn't an individual mistake, but a link out of sync. Excellence would no longer be an achievement. It would be the baseline. Some of the faces around the table were skeptical. A captain leaned forward, asking how they were supposed to add more to an already packed schedule. Reed looked at him without raising her voice. The schedule will bend, she said. The standard will not. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. She turned toward the dry erase board and wrote 2 words in clean, straight letters. Personal accountability. Then she set the marker down and looked at the group again. She moved through the rest of the meeting with precision, assigning tasks like a builder laying a foundation. Communication drills between units would resume by 1600 hours. Radio protocol would be practiced until it became instinct. Every soldier would know who they reported to and who depended on them. By the time the meeting ended, no one spoke. The silence was no longer passive. It felt focused. The officers rose slowly, nodding to one another. For the first time in years, the room didn't feel like a collection of individuals. It felt like a command ready to move in one direction. By day 3, Fort Henderson began to sound different. The lazy silence that once lingered was replaced by the scrape of brooms, the clang of lockers, and the sharp call of orders echoing down the barracks hallways. Soldiers tore through years of neglect, stripping rooms down to bare metal and rebuilding from the ground up. Bunks aligned in perfect symmetry, sheets pulled tight enough to bounce a coin. M4. A1 rifles lay cleaned on inspection tables, bolts gleaming under fluorescent light, their parts checked twice before reassembly. The air smelled like detergent, oil, and something new effort. Outside, squads moved in rhythm. One team repainted curbs and regulation yellow, while another cleared weeds from the sidewalks that had been ignored for years. In the motor pool, Humvees and LMTVs sat in neat rows, their hoods open as mechanics ran full checks, fluids, batteries, tires. Everything logged. Reed's reforms reached every corner. Privates learned to square their corners when folding blankets. NCOs inspected gear with quiet pride. Even the officers, once buried behind paperwork, now walked the lines again, clipboards in hand, sleeves rolled up, setting the example. By day 4, communication drills took over. Radios buzzed across the base as voices trained for precision. Post 1 to HQ. Radio check. Over. HQ copies. Loud and clear. Over. The responses came crisp and fast, like a rhythm tightening in the air. Reed observed from the background, listening for errors, nodding slightly when a call hit the cadence she expected. Mistakes were corrected instantly, not through shouting, but through repetition. The language of discipline returned, not through fear, but through clarity. On day 5, the PT field came alive again. The morning sun lit rows of soldiers running in formation, boots striking the ground in perfect unison. Cadence carried across the base, strong and clear. The sound rolled through the barracks and motor pool, stirring even those not on the field. Reed walked her dawn route quietly, adjusting a collar here, a cover there, offering a quiet good morning that meant more than praise. Private Miller ran the gate crew like a craftsman now, his words sharp, his stance confident. Sergeant Cole held the checklist steady in his hand, his tone even and proud. By the week's end, Fort Henderson no longer looked abandoned. The walls were still old, but the air inside them had changed. Every movement carried intent. Every sound meant purpose. Discipline, onze dormant, had begun to spread again. Slow but steady, like fire finding its fuel. 6 months later, Fort Henderson looked almost unrecognizable. The grass on the parade field was trimmed to regulation height, each blade even and sharp under the morning sun. Rows of Humvees and JLTVs gleamed in perfect alignment near the motor pool. Their paint clean, tires blackened, mirrors straight. The barracks stood freshly painted, their walls bright against the desert light. The flagpole that once leaned now rose true, the stars and stripes catching the wind with renewed strength. The air carried a low hum of readiness, the kind that spoke of pride earned, not borrowed. At 800 hours, the entire garrison assembled on the parade field. Hundreds of soldiers stood in formation, boots lined in perfect symmetry, uniforms crisp and spotless. The brass of their nameplates caught the sun in unison. a reflection of something larger than ceremony. The sound of the national anthem rose, steady and clear, echoing across the base that had once been silent. Applause followed, brief but powerful, then faded into disciplined stillness. Colonel Evelyn Reed stood slightly off to the side, not centered on the stage, her hands folded behind her back, posture composed and steady. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jackson took the podium, his words measured and respectful. He spoke of how Fort Henderson had returned to standard, not through punishment, but through purpose. He credited every soldier who had chosen effort over excuse, every NCO who had led by example, and the quiet, consistent leadership of Colonel Reed. When the Regional Readiness Award was presented, the applause came again, but Reed only nodded, her expression calm. She didn't need to step forward. The field, the soldiers, and the sound of synchronized movement were the proof she had already received. When the formation dismissed, small groups lingered to talk. A young lieutenant said the base finally felt alive again. Another replied that it was because standards had started walking once more. Reed stayed behind for a moment, watching the flag above the field ripple strong against the blue sky. The wind carried the faint echo of cadence from somewhere in the distance. She knew the real victory wasn't the plaque or the ceremony. It was the pride that had returned quietly, step by step, until the base remembered how to stand tall again. The afternoon sun dipped low over Fort Henderson, turning the desert air gold and quiet. Heat shimmered along the asphalt leading to the main gate, the same place where months earlier, discipline had once faltered. Now, it looked like the front line of pride. The curbs were freshly painted, the guardrails gleamed, and the flag above flew straight and strong in the wind. Private Ryan Miller stood at the checkpoint. Posture perfect. Boots aligned with the curb stripe. His uniform was crisp, rifle secured at the correct angle across his chest. The convoy from Regional Command slowed to a stop, sunlight flashing across the polished metal of the lead vehicle. Miller stepped forward, voice steady and calm. "Good afternoon. Sir, welcome to Fort Henderson. May I see your identification and travel orders?" General William Hayes handed him his credentials, and Miller examined them with precision. He scanned the barcode, verified the seal, and keyed his radio. Post 1 to TOC. Vehicle inbound. Credentials verified. Stand by for clearance. The response came crisp and immediate. TOC copies. Clear entry. Miller handed the credentials back, saluted sharply, and stepped aside. The movement was exact, neither rushed nor hesitant. Every gesture reflected hours of training and the quiet pride of ownership. The general watched him for a moment, impressed. He asked who had trained him to run a gate so efficiently. Miller's voice carried a quiet confidence when he answered that Colonel Evelyn Reed had. A few feet away, Reed emerged from behind the booth, air uniform immaculate, eyes calm. She had been there all afternoon, observing without interference. The general straightened and returned her salute sharply, commending the transformation of Fort Henderson. She returned the salute and replied that the base was not brand new, only finally itself again. Traffic continued to move in steady rhythm. IDs checked. Vehicles cleared. Radios calm. The system no longer waited for her approval. It functioned on discipline alone. Reed stepped beside Miller, adjusting the edge of his sleeve until it sat just right. "Keep it that way," she said softly. "Every day, the same." He nodded once, understanding more than words could say. The last rays of sunlight glinted off polished brass and mirrored glass as the convoy rolled forward. Above the gate, the flag rippled against the deepening sky, its reflection bright across the booth window. Fort Henderson stood not as it once was, but as it was meant to be: steady, proud, and alive again.